Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev Podcast. So, what is the secret ingredient in organizations that builds trust and psychological safety, leading to better decision making, increased staff loyalty, flexibility, and engagement, and ultimately higher productivity and profitability as well? The answer is simple, but it takes skill, thought, slowing down, busting quite a few myths along the way, and applying 8 key principles. We're absolutely delighted to be joined by leading author Graham Allcott today, and he has dedicated his latest book, Kind, to uncovering the transformative power of kindness in the workplace. Join us as we explore how this often overlooked quality can reshape teams, leaders, and organizations for the better. And Graham also introduces the concept of a dirty yes, which we think is quite possibly the best new terminology we've heard in ages. If you haven't heard of Graham, and we don't know how you couldn't have done because we're huge fans of Graham, he is an author, speaker, and entrepreneur. He's the author of multiple books, including the global bestseller, How to Be a Productivity Ninja, which we talk about every single week, How to Have Energy, and How to Fix Meetings. His latest book, Kind, focuses on why organizations with kinder, more human-centered cultures are ultimately more successful. He's also the founder of Think Productive, which since 2009 has been a professional development go-to for organizations like Amazon, British Airways, Disney, and eBay, and many more. And they have offices in the UK, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UAE, and Netherlands. In his spare time, and somehow he has spare time, Graham is a DJ with a leaning towards jazz, rare groove, and electronic music. And despite an intolerance of failure elsewhere in his life, he's an Aston Villa season ticket holder and an avid follower of the Toronto Blue Jays baseball team. No stranger to podcasts, having hosted the very successful Beyond Busy podcast. And he also has a brilliant newsletter called Rev Up for the week that comes out at 4 p.m. every Sunday with an upbeat idea to set us up for the week. So thank you so much for joining us, Graham, and thanks so much for making time in the really busy schedule that you have.
Pleasure to be here. And that very comprehensive intro doesn't sound like me. It sounds so impressive. So
Oh,
thank
this is
you.
earned.
Well, thank you for joining us. It's really, really lovely to have you with us. So just to say, we loved Kind. We've devoured it. I love the
Thank
way it
you.
makes the compelling case for kindness at work. It's really pragmatic. It's kind of really hands-on. So we're just going to explore that a bit with you. So just tell us a bit more about the book. What inspired you to write it?
Yes. Okay. So there's a couple of origin stories for where I intersect my work with kindness and also where the book came about. So for many years, my company Think Productive has had as one of our corporate values, trust and kindness are our rocket fuel, and it's just something that we've always really believed in, particularly the trust element. Being honest, really open with everybody that we work with, and just really encouraging people to share the stuff that helps unstick the work that we're doing and the collaboration that we're doing together. So that's kind of always been how we've worked at Think Productive, and I really think that kindness has been a really crucial part actually in building that business over many years. And then with the book itself, I found myself in Rome doing a keynote, and I was talking to this huge conference room about how to be a productivity ninja, which is my best-selling book. And someone asked me this question at the end of the keynote. I'd spoken for about an hour, and then in the Q&A, someone said, "So, okay, you've just talked about productivity. You've just talked about all the stuff that's in your book. What else have you come across, or what else have you used personally to build up your own business?" And it was like really weirdly a question I'd never really been asked before. Everyone just takes it at face value that like, I'm here to talk about productivity. Here's the productivity stuff. And then generally not that interested in my own backstory or, the kind of secret to my success kind of question. So I didn't really know what to say. And then what just came out of me was just kindness fuels everything. When you're kind, you win. It's as simple as that. And I just remember saying these words and just thinking, man, I've just said that on a stage and I didn't really intend to. It was a bit of a surprise and it just sort of came out. And what happened in the room was really interesting. So I talked about kindness and the room quickly sort of divided along these sort of lines of there was a whole bunch of people in Team Kind who really understood it, really got it. Kindness can really help to build team morale. It can build this communication, and people were on my side. And then there was a whole bunch of people in the room who were on team screw them all and be evil. And these people who were saying things to me like, "But what about Donald Trump and Elon Musk? And isn't it all dog eat dog?" And people had this really strong aversion to the idea of kindness having any place at work. And so I just thought, how interesting is that? That something as simple as kindness can have this really polarizing effect, as I'm standing on stage. And then I was in Rome and walking around Rome for the weekend. And just, you walk around Rome and it's just like you're just walking between like all these different human achievements, aren't you? Like it's just such an incredible city for that. And it just really got me thinking about like human beings and what makes us tick and just this polarization around kindness. And before I got on the plane, I just had this revelation of like, this is a book. I just need to really capture like my approach around kindness and what we've done with Think Productive over the years, but also really dig into and address that sort of cynical team screw them all and be evil kind of approach. And even in that room, which was a room of investment bankers, by the way, there were more people on Team Kind than on Team Screw Them All and Be Evil. But it strikes me that the stories that we tell around these archetypes of the business bastard, these kind of, right back to Shylock and Ebenezer Scrooge, this idea that we have around the business bastard is one that really gets in the way of what's really happening, which is this quiet power of kindness as we sort of go through the world. So I just figured that there was a lot of people who would resonate with that message because they were already on Team Kind, and they would want to buy the book for the people that they thought were on Team Screw Them All and Be Evil, or just to up the level of kindness. We think kindness is great. Let's do more of it. Let's, really think about how we can more value the people that we have around us and sort of create that really collaborative culture. So that was the origin story of the book, really. And that was about, probably coming up 5 years ago now. And so it's been a lot of, a lot of blood, sweat and tears, a labor of love, really, to put the research in around it. And I've been teaching Kindful Leadership in that time as well. So sort of taking a lot from the practicalities of teaching stuff. I think, the more you teach stuff, the more you learn stuff often, especially with a topic like this. And so, that's really been the origin story of it. And I think often people think of it as being very far away from how to be a productivity ninja. I actually think, kindness really fuels productivity, and actually productivity requires a lot of kindness. I think there's actually quite a lot of crossover actually between what I'm most known for and then this new book.
And I think one of the things you talk about, one of the kind of 8 pillars of kindness you talk about, is kindness to self, which I guess is linked to the productivity
for sure
kind of side of things. Can you say a bit more about that for us? The importance of kindness to self.
Well, I think when I first started teaching productivity in about 2008, 2009, I thought productivity was all about apps and systems and lists and whatever. Most productivity, especially when you're coaching it and teaching it, is about people's fear and guilt, and I think so often we are unkind to ourselves. We are much more willing to go out of our way to help someone else than we are to get out of our way to help ourselves. And so for me, there's something really important about, like, when we think about kindness, really starting it from what do we need, and that sort of role modeling in our own heads around having an abundance mentality and not scarcity mentality. I think when we think about kindness, the first thought is, how can we pay it forward? How can we help someone else? Who needs our help? And we think really externally, and actually we really need to challenge our own thinking and really make sure that what's in our head is a whole lot of framing around abundance and not scarcity. And what I mean by that, like that scarcity mentality, is, people think about how can they be more productive, or how can they, be kinder. Often the little scarcity mentality in your head is there isn't enough time, or there isn't enough, or I am not enough. And when we flip that into an abundance mentality, what we come up with is there is enough, I am enough. And those are really difficult things to tell ourselves. There's an awful lot of, sort of guilt and self-judgment, self-sabotage that gets in the way of that. But when we can really flip that script in our own heads towards abundance, it makes it much easier to be kinder to everybody else. So we've got to start with ourselves. That self-kindness is not self-indulgent. It's actually like hugely generous when we start kindness from ourselves.
Just going back to what you said about the beginning, you've got team kind and team kind of screw everybody else. Just going to get on and look after myself. What gets in the way of people moving from team evil to team kind? What are the things that get in the way?
Well, I think it's the brainwashing that we receive every day, right? We are taught a whole bunch of stuff. Competition is the highest form of society. Everything's dog eat dog. Everything's competitive. Actually, what is happening in most organizations, if not all organizations, is collaboration and codependence and interdependence are, really more important than independence and competition. And so we are just taught that like competition is the highest form always. If you scroll Instagram and you look at motivational business content, you will see lots of motivational quotes, and the background image is Leonardo DiCaprio with his arms out in Wolf of Wall Street, right? As if that film was supposed to be some kind of user manual for how we build teams. Like, it's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. And I think we really need to, just remember that actually a lot of that is it's making the headlines because it's really interesting. There's Donald Trump, whatever you think of him politically, is a far more interesting character than Kamala Harris or than a CEO that you've never heard of. Because we all have that little part of ourselves which is curious as to what's going on in that man's head and what would it be like if I just didn't play by all the rules. Elon Musk is a fascinating figure for the same reason. We are very invested in the idea of the business baddie, and often in movies and in literature, the baddie is often a more complex and more interesting character than the goodies, right? So we are just, I think, naturally wired and set up to be curious about some of those darker elements of human behavior. And a lot of the people who are going around and clearing up the mess behind an Elon Musk or a Donald Trump, those people are doing that often very quietly. They're not doing it in a flashy way. They are building teams. They are like picking up the pieces and motivating people. And it's totally unremarkable. But that is the norm, right? We are just taught that the Donald Trumps and the Elon Musks are the norm. Actually, what's the real norm is quite, often unremarkable behavior by remarkable people who are kind and who are building that trust and empathy with the people around them. But we don't see that, and it doesn't make great telly. So I interviewed Nick Jenkins for the book. He's the CEO of Moonpig, founder of Moonpig, was one of the dragons on Dragon's Den. And when he was on Dragon's Den, his approach to me seemed to be as helpful as possible and as practical as possible. He gave loads of advice to the people that he didn't even want to invest with. He would always pick out the kind thing to say. And I remember saying to him, when you were on Dragon's Den, was that your strategy for the show? Like you were trying to mix it up and be a bit different to the often quite abrasive approaches of some of the other dragons? And he just looked at me really funny. He was like, well, no, that's just how I do business. How I've built Moonpig to be super successful was by being reasonable and being kind. And actually what I find is that when you do that, people respond better. So I just did that on the show. He only lasted, I think, one series or two series. They kicked him off and got someone else. And I think that speaks volumes. Is that ultimately when we watch Dragon's Den or when we watch The Apprentice, we are so indulged by these, especially the Apprentice characters. We're indulged by this whole thing of, I'm going to stamp all over all of you to get where I need to get to. And, all of that stuff is for me, that's the propaganda of unkindness. It's actually often the propaganda of a certain form of capitalism. And it's just not, it doesn't in any way relate to how most of us are building businesses. So I just think we have to reject all that, and so that was for me a really big motivation behind this book was to really start a very different conversation and to start a conversation that about kindness that is not fluffy, but a conversation about kindness which is about performance. It's about how people build teams, and it's about the benefits that come from working in a way that is transparent and open and empathetic and ultimately kind.
So you talked about the fluffy bit there, and one of the things you do really nicely in the book is you really articulate the difference between being nice and being kind, and the fact that people get that muddled up. And that's part of the reason kindness perhaps doesn't get the support that it should do, because if we got the difference between nice and kind, then it would help make the business case for it even more.
Because I think nice can be quite weak, and obviously fluffy feels quite weak, but kind is something very different. I think for me, kind is actually quite badass, because kind is about being in equal measure being committed to truth and grace. That's really my definition of kindness, is about truth and grace. So I think about kindness in the same way I think about salted caramel. Now, we can all agree that salted caramel is the best food in the world. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And when we think about what makes salted caramel so good, is that you've got these two things working. You've got the salt and then you've got the caramel. So you've got like the saltness and the sweetness. And so if you think about the salt as being like truth, we need a certain amount of truth in order to cut through, right? In order to make things happen or make changes or for people to be able to grow. You need those almost sometimes those kind of bitter moments in order to really push you to the edge of your comfort zone. And then that's where you grow from and that's where things change. And you also, when it comes to salted caramel, you need the sweetness as well, right? So you need that grace, you need that ability to be able to put the salt in a format that really makes it work. If you have even the slightest bit too much salt in your food, your entire meal is ruined. So too much truth, just people can't take it. And it's just a really dangerous thing. If all of your food is the sweetness of caramel, it gets sickly very quickly. And it doesn't become, it's not something you can eat a whole meal out of. So it's having those two elements together, the truth and the grace is, for me, what really makes and differentiates between being kind and being nice. Often niceness it's all about the sickly sweet. It's actually trying to deny the truth or shirk the truth. So just a little example in terms of like a business example for that. So if you're in a meeting and your colleague is, making a pitch or making a presentation in that meeting and they've done it really badly and you can sense there's like a tension in the room or like it hasn't gone well. And then at the end of that meeting, your colleague comes up to you and they say something like, so how did I do? Was it good? Then you have a choice in that moment and you can either take the kind approach or the nice approach. And the nice approach is they say, how did it go? Did I do okay? And you go, yeah, it was fine. And you shirk the truth in that moment. That's the nice response. It's like we keep the peace, we just pretend that it was all okay, but we're ultimately lying. We're ultimately shirking that truth. What's more difficult, what makes kindness a badass approach is that that's going to be inconvenient for you. You're going to have to probably put some time in your diary tomorrow to sit down with that person and give them that feedback. It's brave. You're going to have to tell them stuff that they perhaps aren't going to like. You're going to have to tell them stuff that are perhaps truths about themselves that are difficult. And you have to do that with a level of skill and a level of empathy that's actually quite difficult to do. So it really is a very skillful thing to pick kindness in that moment. A lot of people will just pick nice, and probably anyone listening to this, me included, we can all think of those moments where we've picked nice, where we could have picked kind. And so that for me is why there's a big difference between those two ideas. But also I think because they get so confused, that's why you get people saying things like there's no place for kindness in business or kindness is weakness. I think niceness can be weakness, but kindness I think is something very, very different.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because I think if you're going to lean into those types of conversations, so because when you're giving someone feedback, you're actually putting your relationship in jeopardy.
Yeah.
Because if you're going for nice, it's like, I just want our relationship to be okay. That's the highest context here. So no, actually, I want you to be the best version of whatever it is that you want to be. So I'm actually going to place this above it. And that's a real risk, isn't it, as well?
It is. When I talk about truth and grace, which that phrase truth and grace came from my colleague, Christina Kisley, and she describes the grace part as the real grace is when you're acting from a place where you're for the other person. So you're making this almost like emotion. I sort of think about it as almost like this emotional connection, like you're reaching out to them. It's like, I'm so for you and I so believe in you that like I'm willing to put myself on the line a little bit. I'm willing to say the thing that's uncomfortable. I'm willing to take that little risk. And that's why as well, I talk a lot in the book about the role that psychological safety plays, because when you have the confidence to take those interpersonal risks, that's where you get to much better places. And a lot of the research in the book talks to the idea that kindness and empathy drives trust and trust drives psychological safety. And when you have that psychological safety, it's much easier to make those kind of calls.
You mentioned empathy there. So you talk about kindness and empathy as kind of reinforcing loop. And you say that empathy isn't innate. So yes, some people are more empathetic than others, but it's not something that we either are or we aren't, and we can cultivate it and develop it. What advice would you give to people who are working with maybe leaders who are lacking empathy? How do they start to develop it?
How do you start to develop? Well, I mean, I think, yeah, so the first thing to say is that we can develop it. And so it's a neuroplasticity thing. You can actually, there are things that you can do that can alter your brain chemistry and neural networks around empathy. One of the tools that I do talk about in the book is the idea of meta meditation, which I think can be really helpful. So this is basically a short meditation where you kind of you mentally go through the people and things in your life, and you wish those people to be well. You wish those people to have peace, to have ease, and you start with your kids or your partner or close family, and then you work your way all the way through to at the end, wishing peace and ease to your enemies or to the people who've hurt you. And I think there's something quite interesting about that. And I've found it over the years. I've sort of done that meditation on and off over many years. And there's something very interesting about the sort of physicality and what sort of happens in your body where you start trying to wish ease and peace to people who've wronged you. I think it's a really brave and really difficult thing to contemplate. So I think that's something that can really help. There's a whole process for that in the book. I think the other thing though is, and this is the thing I've done for many years with Think Productive, is just bringing a little bit of that humanity and personality into meetings and just doing that regularly. And if you're doing that as the chair of a meeting, the most empathetic people in the room are going to be picking up on those signals massively. But even the people who are less empathetic, it's kind of really encouraging them to kind of walk a mile in the shoes of the person who's talking. So it's just really simple little things like at the start of a meeting, if let's say you've got 5 people in a meeting, just having a few moments at the beginning where everybody checks in and says, how they're feeling and one thing that's going well, for example, is a really kind of standard one that I use. And then at the end of the meeting to just check out with one thing you valued and one thing you're looking forward to. And just doing that just gives everybody the chance to listen to what's going on in everyone else's head, which is something that if you just go straight into focusing on the business, you don't often really get those sort of slightly more emotional or sort of personal reflections. It's just, data about task kind of thing. So that's something that I've just found really useful over many years at Think Productive. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff you could do, obviously, but yeah, just as a couple of little tips, those are definitely ones to follow, I think.
I love that check-in idea because you can do that even if you're hybrid or it's not an impediment to doing that, is it?
Yeah,
So really
for sure.
powerful. So I had a question about one of the 8 pillars of kindness is you talk about is people first, work second, always. And from reading what you've talked about and hearing you talk before, you really live that Think Productive, don't you? It's not just something you've put on the wall and said, people first, work second, and then that's not the first. Because a lot of organisations we work with, they say, yeah, people first, work second. The minute there's any pressure, that's the people thing is the first thing to go. So what does it really take to live that as an organisation and as a leader?
Stubbornness. So the most important word in that phrase is the word always. People first, work second, always. And it came about because we went through this period at Think Productive where we had a relatively young, relatively healthy, fit, active staff team. And people were just dropping like flies all around us. People needed surgery, there was illnesses, there was bereavements. There was just this period where it just felt like we just couldn't catch a break, as a team. And it was sort of coincided with a period where I was thinking a lot about kindness and the values of the company and stuff. I did this whole experiment for a month called Radical Kindness quite a few years ago. And the phrase kind of came out of that where whenever somebody was in that situation and they'd sort of come to you with the call, as a manager, when you get the call, right? Which is sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's a WhatsApp voice note, sometimes it's an email, whatever it looks like. But it's that thing of, hey, like problem back at the ranch, some kind of issue. I might need a day out, I might need a week out, something's gone on. So whenever you get that call, for me, that is one of the biggest opportunities you have to demonstrate kindness because you're facing people at the very moment where they need it the most, right? And in my experience, when you really dig into the kindness then, even when it's the most inconvenient, then people don't forget that stuff. Like people will be loyal to you because of that. They'll remember it. They will step up and help somebody else who needs it further down the line. It really kind of it gets you and sort of gets you in the heart and it really is something that becomes cultural. But I started using that. So whenever I'd get the call, I would send the text back that said, okay, let's remember people first, work second, always. Now, what do you need? And I put that very deliberately with that word always in there. And the word always is really a sort of public declaration and commitment that no matter whether it's the biggest client, the biggest day of the year, like whatever's going on, what is happening in your life matters more than the stuff that we're doing right here. You know, I did a thing a couple of weeks ago with where I literally was talking about kindness to a whole bunch of surgeons, people doing brain surgery, or whatever. It's like there it might be life or death, but most of the time when I'm talking to organizations, I can use the phrase, okay, well, no one's going to die, so let's start with that, and then it's like if someone really needs you, and what I realized was like we had this really young, fit team, and all these things were happening. But what I realized was, oh, actually, I had the framing all wrong. Is that the idea that all of that was bad luck is wrong? Like life is suffering. You know, there is a lot of suffering in our lives, and in, you know, as we go through life in different phases of life, and so we have to like start with that just being a given, you know, and so always is a really important word because it holds our feet to the fire, but it also reminds us that it's always somebody's always, you know, there's always going to be one member of the team that really needs needs us to step up, needs to take some time out, whatever. And if you don't know who that is right now, as a manager, you probably need to be paying more attention. And if it's not you, then what a privilege. And so your job is to step up for the people who it is that situation. And so we've kind of run it like that, like for years at Think Productive. And often that has meant, you know, as a business owner, that has meant paying, you know, regular wages for many weeks, often months, out of my own pocket for people who are not there. And that costs, you know, and that hurts when it's a small business, but like I've never regretted it. It's always been worth it because what you gain back from that is a whole bunch of people who are committed to that as being the philosophy and the way that we work. And they all are now the people who step up when someone else needs it. And it just, you know, it carries on and carries on. So yeah, I think that's just a really important principle for me.
When I was reading the book, one of the things that, because we read a lot of books, so we read a lot. But there's just,
I'm looking forward to getting back to that, by the way. I've just
it's
with
great.
finishing the writing of this book and then and all that, I feel like my own reading has been neglected. So yeah.
Well, there was one, because you have sort of 8 fundamental principles that underpin the kindness, and there was one thing that kind of really sort of stood out, and maybe put the book down and really think about it. And you look at it from a number of different ways. It's really impactful. Is the fact that busyness is the accidental source of unkindness. And then if you start to think about it on so many different levels, the impact that has in organizations, isn't it? Because so often when you see that there's conflict or whatever, and you wind the clock back, it is often done on good intention, isn't it? People don't set out to be unkind, but it's just, it happens just like, what was it that drove you to make it one of the 8 principles?
So the principle is called slow down, and yeah, the start of that chapter says the biggest source of accidental unkindness is busyness. That came about because when I was teaching Kindful Leadership, it always became this thing that on about week 3 or week 4, people would go, "Oh, if I'm going to start to develop empathy, if I'm going to really increase my levels of kindness, then I have to slow down." And I definitely feel that personally. You know, when I'm 100 miles an hour, as I have been a lot over the last few weeks with the book, you know, you don't necessarily just stop and have those slightly more intentional interactions. So, you know, it's like when you walk into a shop and it's like, if you're not super busy, you'll start with, "Oh, how are you?" or whatever. But like if you're super busy, it's like, "Get me the thing now, I've got my train," or whatever. And so you are just entering that interaction being slightly less kind. And I think we have the same you know, mentality at work as well. So it's often one of those light bulb moments when I teach Kindful Leadership is, hang on, if I'm going to really connect with people on a more empathetic level, I've just got to slow down and take a step back. And, you know, it really is a big light bulb for people. So yeah, one of the challenges in that chapter is the idea of just sitting on a bench and doing nothing and not having your phone, but just sitting there. And I think if you're listening to this, just ask yourself, when was the last time you sat anywhere and just did nothing? And just, I think one of the most important parts of that is when you do nothing, you start to recognize your own lizard brain thoughts, right? You start to really listen to what's kind of buzzing around in your own head. And often we fill all those gaps with scrolling or, media or whatever, podcasts as we're walking around the house or whatever. And, actually just sitting and doing nothing or sitting in silence can just be such a great indicator of like what's really going on in your own head and your own psychology.
Yeah, and you also introduced a scientific element to it, because it's not as simple as, yes, we have an intent to do it, but there's a lot of chemicals involved here: oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine as well.
Yeah.
What were some of your findings from the research there?
An awful lot changes when one person commits one kind act, right? So if you think about one person being kind to one other person, you have that person increases their levels of serotonin, so the happiness hormones, oxytocin, they feel more connected to the person they're being kind to, and dopamine, which is, that sense of having a reward or, feeling satisfied. All that's happening in the person of the person who's being kind. You're also getting the oxytocin and serotonin from the person who is having that kind act done to them. And you've also got a whole bunch of brain chemicals happening for people who are witnessing that effect as well. So there's a big study that coined the term the Mother Teresa effect, which is the idea of they gave people this video that was like half an hour long, where you watch Mother Teresa doing these kind things, and then they measured levels of a chemical in your mouth, in your saliva, called salivary immunoglobulin, which is a very important chemical to well-being. It's part of the thing that fights off toxins, in our food and in the world around us. And so basically, the more you have of that chemical, the better your levels of well-being. And it found that people had this sense of a high just from having watched someone else be kind. You don't even have to be kind to get these effects. So when you look at it like that, there's an awful lot that we're leaving on the table if we, in a moment, just choose to do the convenient thing and not the kind thing. And so we can think of an act of kindness as costing us 5 minutes of our day or whatever, but actually choosing not to be kind is costing a lot more in terms of that sense of well-being that's sort of going on around us. Particularly the sense of, we think about the person who is the beneficiary of kindness, but actually, so the other bit of terminology I learned through the research was the idea of the helper's high. So that sense of the sort of dopamine increase and oxytocin increase, really shows us that we get healthier when we are the person helping, when we are the person being kind. So even just on that level, there's also 23% less cortisol in your blood when you are kind. So cortisol being the stress hormone, you're 23% less stressed just by being kind. So there is a lot going on when one person is kind, and kindness has a ripple effect. So the more, when you commit to that act of kindness, you should also be thinking about the ripple effect of someone else being inspired by that, them doing something kind. So when you leave that on the table, it's like just a massive impact when you don't take that kindness route.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about the business thing again. So I made lots of notes when I was reading your book.
I love it.
When you were talking
these are
about
these are the bacon bookmarks. So I think that is actually a new record for the most bookmarks.
So one of the questions
Is there a book under there or not?
There is just about, yeah. One of the questions that really pulled me up, one of the questions for reflection at the end of the business chapter was about the busyness pillar was, what stories am I telling myself about why I'm so busy? And the brackets, if your first thought is, no, I'm special, I've got reasons why I'm so busy, then you need to spend longer contemplating this question. And I thought, oh yeah, that's
yeah,
that's got me. Yeah.
Part of that, I think, comes from working with organizations over 15 years on productivity, and the amount of times an organization has said, well, we're really special, we're really different, and then they've proceeded to tell me exactly the same issues that I hear everywhere else. And so I do think we often have this exceptionalism, right? It's like, yeah, those people over there aren't doing it right, but actually I'm probably making really great decisions. And it's just a bias that we all have, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I have it too. I'm totally not immune from any of this stuff. And have a very, over many years, like an interesting relationship with the word busy. Like I've really tried to put sort of structures and habits in place that sort of slow me down and keep me away from busy. But that's because my natural inclination is to be very ambitious and quite sort of A-type in a lot of stuff. And so I kind of need those restrictions in place really to sort of stop myself becoming the sort of busy, addicted sort of, boss from hell or whatever.
In the introduction, we talked about the dirty yes. This is Danny picked up on this, and since then I've
Yeah.
fallen in love with the term. Can you just unpack that a little bit, what it is and how it occurs in organizations?
Yeah, well, this is like coming back to that definition between nice and kind. So the dirty yes is what is where you nod along in a meeting, and when someone goes, "Is everyone cool with this? Are we agreeing with this? Are we?" And you go, "Yeah," or whatever, and then you're bitching about that person behind their back, right? So you're not really in full support of the thing, but you're shirking the truth, or for some other reason, you're just not bringing your own thoughts to the table. And I think that happens a lot where you don't have psychological safety, where people feel like, well, the boss is saying this and we've done all this before, but to be honest, we'll just nod and go along with it. So I think it's really important to try and avoid some of those dirty yeses. And actually what I see a lot, so when I do keynote talks, I'm often doing them at conferences or away days, and I've lost track of the number of times I've witnessed one of those conversations where someone will be talking in acronyms for like 10 minutes. And then someone at the back of the room sheepishly puts their hand up and goes, I don't know what INJ6 is, or like what that stands for, or whatever. And you see half the room, their shoulders just like relax. And it's like, oh, thank goodness someone actually said that. So I think a really good rule of thumb, which I often, talk about with teams and stuff, is if you are feeling like unclear, or if you're feeling like there's a niggle or there's something that really needs to be said, often when you say it, you'll see half the room go, thank goodness. And so you just need that little bit of bravery at the beginning to be the one that stands up and says, hey, I'm not going to sign up to this. I'm not going to subscribe to this dirty yes. I'm actually going to give you some interrogation of that idea and a bit of an objection to that idea. Maybe even I'm going to give you an alternative thing that we could do instead. And often when you do that, yeah, you'll find a lot of people say, oh, thank you for being the one who was brave and, put your head above the parapet. So I just think it's really important to know that that's happening around us and happening in everyone else's heads,
So you do loads of things, so author, podcaster, keynote speaker. What aspects of your work bring you the most joy? What do you find most fulfilling?
It's often said with someone who's an author and a speaker is that you're either a great author who does a bit of speaking, or you're a great speaker who occasionally writes a book, And so I think it's often, for me, like I think about that a lot. Like which one am I sort of most comfortable in? And I think, in general, to be honest, where I'm happiest is in my shed, writing, researching, ideas generation, and all of that. Not that I don't enjoy the speaking. I love the speaking. But the speaking takes a lot out of me just energetically. So that's kind of, yeah, like I do this weekly email called Rev Up for the Week, which you mentioned at the beginning, which goes out every Sunday, 4:05 p.m., just picked a random time. And I just really love the process of writing it. So I write it every week. It's not done with AI. They're never batched up and then released, drip feed over a week. It's always a piece of writing that I've done that week. They tend to be, probably the best part of 1,000 words, most of them. And the idea is it's just like one free thing, one useful idea to just share for the week ahead. And that's my kind of weekly newsletter thing. And I just really love writing those. And I've been given a few AI tools over the last few weeks that could very easily replace me in that role. And my reaction to that is no way. Because for me, the writing process is also my thinking process. It's my reflection time. It's just a really important process. And I definitely think, having done that solidly for sort of 4 or 5 years now, I look at the quality of the writing in Kind is way better than the quality of the writing in How to Be a Productivity Ninja, which is my first book. And probably most writers say that. And, everyone's got their embarrassing early works, like George Michael wrote Club Tropicana and then probably hated it when he was, doing his serious solo career phase. But I do think it's made me a better writer by having it be the process. So, yeah, I think probably, the writing and ideas generation and the sort of creative part of it. But yeah, obviously a big part of what I do is the speaking and the workshops and just sharing the ideas. The ideas are are great, but when they come to life and you see people going, oh yeah, I'm going to take this back, or this has changed how I work, or whatever, like that's always huge for me as well.
One of the things you talk about is the fact that we may have an intention to be kind, but the world doesn't necessarily reciprocate that. And often we'll see things at work where there isn't kindness. What do we do when we're seeing behaviors that aren't kind from others? Like what are our options really? And even if it's potentially from our manager, for example, who has that reward power over us.
Yeah, so I've been asked this question a lot over the last few weeks. What do you do when your kindness isn't reciprocated? And I think the answer is it depends on who. I think if you have a toxic line manager and that person is going to be in post for a while, you're probably better off finding a new place to work, because I think over time, that person is going to change you more than you're going to change the situation. And it won't be good. So I think that's the sort of caveat. But if what you're seeing is there are some people on the team and they're busy, and maybe that busyness is what's leading to accidental unkindness, then I do think just role modeling it, and just not just role modeling it, but really whenever you get a chance, banging the drum for kindness, explaining the fact that you were kind in that moment and what it led to, really talking about some of the impacts of some of those kind of behaviors, either from you or from someone else, and also thinking about who are the other sort of champions of it around you. I talk in the book about the old England football manager Sven-Göran Eriksson, and he had this terminology of the cultural architect. So who are the people around you that you can build the culture around, and the people who are kind of the fellow travelers that they're on team kind. If you can get those people all sort of pincer approach talking about it, then you can have quite a big influence, I think. So I think it really depends. If it's a toxic boss, and you don't see them changing anytime soon, I think the most likely and the best change is you changing and moving somewhere else. But I think if it's just other people on the team, I think you can have a lot of influence to really start to change that culture for sure.
One question that we always ask in every conversation is, what have been some of the biggest lessons that you've learned along the way?
Wow, that's a big question.
It's a big question. You can take it any direction you want to.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a bit of a cliche thing, but I think, especially when you're in the early stages of building a business, you can really sweat the wrong small stuff. So I think certain things where you really need the product to be right, or the detail to be right, you want to really double down on those and be really committed to making that as quality as it can be, or as great as it can be, and like don't compromise. But there are also like so many bits of advice that you get, or so many models that you try and follow. And actually, like business, just like building a team, it's often not a perfect or a linear route. And so I think you can often get really stuck into trying to do it properly, or trying to do it the way so and so's done it, or like modeling it in a certain way. And actually, you just have to have a slightly more open approach, I think, and just be okay with things falling apart, or things being imperfect, or you pivoting to something else. And so, I think like over the years, there's definitely been times where I've been too sort of concerned or committed to like things like being structured a certain way, or me developing the business in a certain way. And often it just develops how it's going to develop, it sort of gets a life of its own, and it goes its own way. So yeah, sweat some of the small stuff, but like also don't sweat all the small stuff.
I can say we'll link to Kind in the show notes so people can access that. But if people want to take their learning further, what's the best way to kind of do that? How can they follow you? How do they learn more?
Yes, so you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and probably the best way just to sort of start the process, if you go to grahamallcott.com/links, there you'll find a bit of everything that I'm doing. So, my Kind for Leadership program, which starts in January. At the end of Feb, I'm doing 6 weeks to Ninja again, which is my kind of annual 6-week productivity thing. So those are both 2 live programs working directly with me. And then also on that grahamallcott.com/links is signing up to Rev Up for the Week, and just like everything else that I do.
And all of that will all be in the show notes. So whether you're listening to this on audio or on video, that'll all be available for you as well. Graham, we want to say a huge thank you. We know you've been intensely busy sort of getting the book out there, writing the book. So we really appreciate your time. Danny, what are you taking away from today's conversation?
Oh, lots and lots of things. I've really enjoyed it. So, but I think the fact, the idea of kindness being around truth and grace is going to stick with me. I love the Mother Teresa effect, that ripple effect of being kind and really being aware of that. And the business thing, just just calling ourselves out on why are we so busy and why are we holding that up as a badge of honor sometimes, and how do we step away from that?
Yeah, so many things for me, and all of those things. I love the definition of truth and grace and the salted caramel. I'm in that team as well. I love the way that we just clarified the definition between nice and kind, and the fact that kind is actually, it takes a lot of courage and really leaning into the difficult things as well. And I also love about the whole culture architect as well, making sure that those are the right people you support. Graham, I want to say a huge thank you. It's been brilliant. We've loved it. It's been great. If you've enjoyed this podcast with Graham, we'd love it if you hit the like button. If anything that Graham has said with you today that's resonated with him, please put it in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think about it as well. And feel free to hit the like button and subscribe. But thank you so much, Graham. Really wishing you lots of luck with the rest of the book. And I know you're probably it's the last thing, but please do let us know if you've got another book coming as well, because we always really enjoy reading them.
Will do. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.